And that brings us to our first student presentation with Ferda Sackman. Ferda has a background in psychiatry with additional training in psychoanalysis and medical acupuncture. Her emphasis has been on the intersection between neuroscience, physiology, and psychotherapy, and on the role of trauma and unprocessed emotions in medical psychiatric disorders. She has also been dedicated to the subjective study of consciousness and its relation to physical reality. She has worked with various spiritual approaches to that end. She is currently not practicing medicine and is not licensed as a physician, as she integrates her spiritual studies with practical life. She is taking part 2 of a quantum mechanics for scientists and engineers course. Okay, so Ferda, are you ready?
Yes, I'm Ferda. My advisor was Bruce Schofield, sorry. He's here under my name right now. He's showing up as the second Ferda Sackman, but he's also here. And thank you everyone for showing up. My topic is astrology as a scientific discipline, and I'm going to give you a brief overview in a nutshell because I'm going to kind of go over a broad range of topics, and I want to make it clear what my point is supposed to be from the get-go so that we don't get lost too much. It's about the fact that spiritual traditions have studied an aspect of reality that the modern Western scientific field has been agnostic to so far. And one of the main points is that an in-depth understanding of subjectivity and consciousness leads to answers to many, if not most, crucial scientific questions that are lingering today. And that from that perspective, astrology isn't really in a position to prove its legitimacy to the scientific field, but instead it's about human evolution reaching a place where the scientific consensus can house certain facts about reality that were previously rejected or seen as unscientific. So that's the nutshell. I'm giving a tongue-in-cheek disclaimer because, as you can see, I'm kind of making bold statements. And I want to clarify that my general approach is one of, in my humble opinion, it's not meant as an exhaustive discussion of any of the topics that I mentioned, like science, consciousness, even astrology or spiritual teachings. The purpose is mostly to convey a message along the lines that I mentioned just now. And the message is about those fields and how they interact with each other. Those topics, each one of them have, a whole field behind them, systems, schools of thought. So they're not to be taken lightly. But for the purpose of this talk, I had to be very concise and to the point. So I just invite everyone to settle into their own intuitive thinking and common sense. And I don't know if I'm able to take questions during the presentation, but if you have questions, I'd be happy to answer them whenever we can. So I'm breaking down this presentation into 3 pieces. The first point I'm going to make is about science itself, which again, I'm purporting that physics is heading towards a consciousness-based understanding of reality. And from that point, I'm going to build to the fact that astrology would then become relevant as a natural result of that understanding. That's what its place was in society in the past. And the third point is that if you believe in 1 and 2, then it's just a matter of time that astrology will be integrated into mainstream science. And I'm being very liberal with the idea that it's a matter of time. It might be after my lifetime. I'm leaving it open, but I think it's just a natural progression of how things are going. So I'm going to start with the first point, and I'm going to talk a little bit about science and physics, but it's not going to be too hefty, hopefully, and I'm going to tie it back to astrology soon. So the topics here that I'm just going to go over is I'm going to touch on where modern physics is as far as I can see it, and what consciousness could be defined as, and then what a consciousness-based perspective in science would look like. So I'm just going to look at the time. I'm talking about a paradigm shift. It's a big deal. And the way a paradigm shift would be defined is that it takes everything from before and creates a new synthesis of everything that was explored and kind of maybe is fragmented, but it brings forth a new truth that integrates everything else and makes things clear, and also is a push into a new kind of reality. And this is being talked about a lot, especially in places like the astrological community outside of science. But a lot of people, I think, are anticipating something like this. And I also believe that that's where we're at. The process that I'm seeing is, it's called transcend and include. This is from integral theory for anyone who has followed Ken Wilber. This is basically how a paradigm shift happens, which is that, you know, the existing paradigm starts to become transcended over time, gradually. That piece is probably largely unspoken, and then at some point there's a breakthrough, and then things have to be reconfigured and kind of put into a new perspective. So that's the include part where the integration happens. And there's also a definition online that I liked. Every new level of complexity both transcends the limitations of the earlier level and includes the less complex structure into itself. So it's the process of breaking through and then integrating everything that needs to be carried forward from the past. So this is a very simple breakdown of history, where, you know, before the scientific revolution, there was natural philosophy. Let's just, you know, leave it there. And back then, we can summarize the general situation as it was much more in touch with intuitive thinking and common wisdom, and, you know, philosophy, things that are now seen as more philosophical or within the purview of religion and metaphysics were kind of all in one cauldron, let's call it. And astrology and astronomy were also kind of merged together. And then after the scientific method became the way science is done, and things became completely externalized, and astronomy and astrology became completely separate things, where astronomy is right, astrology is just crazy, kind of. So that was where science was at. Now, I'm going to also talk about what happened after the, you know, in the past century, since the 1900s. That's when classical mechanics was there, with Newtonian principles being the main kind of way of thinking. And then the transcend phase started, is how I'm seeing it. I'm putting 2023 there so we know where we're at. The transcending basically was when things started to become very different from before. Einstein's relativity and quantum mechanics, and, you know, the standard model also leading to string theory, things became unusual, mysterious, a little groundbreaking, and, you know, raising a lot of questions that were difficult to answer. And I'm seeing this as the beginning of subjectivity coming into the center of, you know, discussion in science, even if it's not talked about as subjectivity. Einstein was talking basically about, you know, we don't really know if that's like a fixed thing. What we're observing is not fixed. So what's what is basically what happened to the line of thinking. And new levels of subtle detail had to be questioned because subatomic particles became also a part of the story. So a lot of unexpected and challenging questions came. I'm summarizing the general status quo right now as like, there's a group of people who think this is very exciting, where things are at, with crazy topics being talked about, you know, the nature of reality. Some people are saying what's going on, and then some people are just like, you guys are crazy, just, you know, be real. So my suggestion is that we're going towards understanding consciousness on a deeper level, so that we can integrate everything, because there's a lot of conflict between these. So, yes. So just to kind of summarize what I'm saying, I see the need for a breakthrough, because everyone knows that consciousness is a very real thing and part of our existence that needs to be addressed, but it's not really practically applicable right now in science. And as we're getting to smaller and smaller levels of description, it's becoming an issue as theories conflict with each other. There's increasing tension with things like, you know, what is gravity, because general relativity is saying one thing, quantum mechanics is saying another, and so on and so forth. So again, I'm saying that there's a need to address consciousness, and there are some symptoms of this that I'm just going to go over quickly in two parts. I'm going to start with, Tesla actually talked about this back in 1934. Today's scientists have substituted mathematics for experiments, and they wander off through equation after equation and eventually build a structure which has no relation to reality. He said this back in 1934. This is a magazine called Modern Mechanics and Inventions, and there was a column called The World by Nikola Tesla. So I think that this is still going on, personally. So the first issue is that there's a lack of distinction between concept and mathematics and reality. Again, because we're talking about subtle levels of reality, we have to address the question of what is perception, what is observation, and things that spiritual disciplines have been talking about, which, thought and physical form and the connection between those two. Things like the measurement problem are in quantum mechanics, if anyone is familiar with that. There's still kind of an open-ended discussion about, probability versus reality. Is a wave function just reflective of probability? Or is it something in reality that are we creating that thing by thinking about it or by observing it? So it's in discussion. And because there's so many concepts flying around and the theories that conflict with each other, it's become kind of normal for regular people, for us, non-physicists, to not really understand the concepts or, what is being talked about, what are these particles, it's normal for it to not speak to common sense. And I see that as a symptom of things having to be kind of cleared up. And the issue number 2 is the question of subjectivity and consciousness, like I said. So there are all these questions, conflicts, and mysteries. And then there's the question of consciousness that's not being directly addressed, which is the elephant in the room, in my opinion. So there's no satisfactory understanding. It's acknowledged as something that is difficult to know, if not impossible to know about. And there's no formal attempt to pursue an understanding because of that. There's also a lack of acknowledgement of, subjectivity in terms of the fact that that's what we use all the time to do anything, including science. So the discussions about this have always been pretty alive in the physics community and philosophy, but it's on the intellectual level. And in fact, in the past few years, I think it's been increasing, but it never goes down to the experiential level. So I'm saying basically that at some point, I think has to be a breaking point where the study of subjectivity has to become more of a center, discussion. And the fact that spiritual disciplines have been doing this for a very long time with results that have been consistent between traditions is an important piece of this as well. Okay, so this is the second part where I'm going to talk about, well, what is consciousness then? In neuroscience or physiology, the studies of consciousness are basically focused on the human experience, the human mind, waking life, mental states, really. So it's not really the kind of consciousness study that spiritual traditions talk about. And in philosophy of mind, similarly, more existential questions are addressed, but it kind of has to remain on the intellectual level because there's nothing grounding it in terms of subjectivity or experience. These are 2 very famous philosophers, David Chalmers talking about the hard problem of consciousness, facing up to the problem of consciousness, and then Dan Dennett responding with facing backwards on the problem of consciousness. So there's a lot of discussion, a lot of schools of thought, a lot of viewpoints that seem complementary but also conflict with each other. Basically, there's a lot. And on YouTube, over the years, you can find so many videos about this and coming at it from different perspectives, different disciplines, but there's no foreseeable resolution, basically. And so I'm just putting a stop to this right now and just going to point out 2 things that we're really talking about subjectivity, and that's, indispensable in terms of we wouldn't exist, we wouldn't be able to talk about this if it weren't for subjectivity. And by nature, it's a little difficult for the current scientific perspective because it's the study of one person from within. So the sample size is 1. And basically the only thing that you can do is you can share in terms of peer review or replicability, you can share your experience with others, or you can find out what it means to know something really. What is truth? What is not? There's a lot of deep questions that come up with it. And this has been studied with resolution to these questions from the point of view of spiritual traditions, and it exists as knowledge in our collective. And one important thing that they found as a result of these studies is that consciousness is primary to reality. So physical reality is an expression of consciousness, is a known thing for spiritual traditions. And here, consciousness is not the kind of consciousness I was talking about before in the study of neuroscience, for example. There, it's usually talked about as the self, or the human mind, or the subjective experience of a human being. Whereas in spiritual traditions, it's about everything. So there's a lot of detail about the brain's involvement, for example, in the scientific study of consciousness. But from an ontological perspective, that's a very limited kind of snapshot. So I'm just going to summarize what the spiritual way, or what the way is when you study it internally. What do you find about consciousness and its relation to reality? It's basically that it's the basic unit of reality. Everything is formed from consciousness. Some other terms that kind of capture consciousness from that perspective: existence or being, awareness, experience, or even information on many dimensions. Another concept is isness, related to being. So it's just the basic unit of existing. It's not further reducible, and human consciousness, as it's talked about in science, is an extension of it. So it's not unrelated, but it's, again, a very limited snapshot. And again, this has been described in a lot of detail by spiritual traditions for millennia. So it's not inaccessible at all. It's there, but it requires, a perspective to take it in. So I'm going to summarize what reality would look like, or what the basic principles are that we take away from that understanding of consciousness and reality. Two important pieces to this is that, again, if consciousness is forming everything, then we have a continuous tapestry of consciousness. And there's a spectrum between physical and what we could call non-physical, things like thoughts or emotions, for example, on a very basic level. These are all made of the same thing, but it forms a spectrum. And then from that, it's also important to note that reality is a flow of successive snapshots of these existence things, existence snapshots. So it's a successive flow of these snapshots being created in the now to give us the experience of physical reality, or things happening around us. And another important piece is that there are principles to that flow of successive snapshots. So it's not random, and there are I'm putting these concepts on it. First of all, there's like a higher intelligence portion to it. This is what becomes very controversial. It's very matter of fact if you think of it in terms of something makes sense, right? Let's say seasons, or the flow of anything around us on this planet. There's something guiding it. That's what I'm referring to as higher intelligence. I'm not necessarily giving it any other concept, but there's something that allows, for example, a plant to grow, and there are principles behind that. Similarly, natural laws, again, seasons or death, the fact that we die, we're born and then we die, simple things like that. And then there are also more complex things, like what Jung calls archetypes, where there are certain repeating patterns and themes in the flow of consciousness. These are the things that people have found over centuries to be consistent in how consciousness works. So the bottom line of what I'm saying is that, to wrap up everything that I've said so far with science and consciousness, I think that core aspects of this understanding are already present in the popular discourse. It's definitely being talked about. People are even excited about it. It seems mysterious, but also, you know, something seems meaningful as far as I can tell to people. When they think about these topics, it gets very existential and scary, but also meaningful. But it really needs to be integrated into kind of like a formal understanding, because it can't be kept on the level of intellectual discussion if it's going to have like a practical use. I'm saying also that, you know, since Einstein, we've been kind of going from an object-based reality where we're describing things and how they behave to a more subtle, malleable, and vibrational one. And this is really available in the way that people are talking about physics and especially quantum mechanics and ramifications of that. So it's already there, but it needs to be integrated and understood clearly, is my point. Another way of looking at it is that various levels of information are interacting with each other, and gross levels are what we experience as physical reality. The reason I'm saying that this seems to already be there is I'm going to show you a video to kind of illustrate that. This is a recent video from the past few months. It's 2 minutes long. Brian Greene, the theoretical physicist, is talking about string theory and its viability.
Messy and confusing. For more than a century, scientists have been on a quest for a theory of everything, a comprehensive solution that would not only reconcile this puzzling contradiction between quantum physics and general relativity. Messy and confusing. For more than a century, scientists have been on a quest for a theory of everything, a comprehensive solution that would not only reconcile this puzzling contradiction between quantum physics and general relativity, but also make sense of all the forces, particles, and interactions in the universe through one all-encompassing equation. String theory is one such proposed solution. It suggests that everything in the universe, at its most basic level, is made of tiny, vibrating strings of energy.
Well, it's a theory that tries to answer the question, what are the basic, fundamental, indivisible, uncuttable constituents making up everything in the world around us? The idea is like this. So imagine we look at a familiar object, just a candle and a holder, and imagine that we want to figure out what it is made of. So we go on a journey deep inside the object and examine the constituents. So deep inside, we all know you go sufficiently far down, you have atoms. We also all know that atoms are not the end of the story. They have little electrons that swarm around a central nucleus with neutrons and protons. Even the neutrons and protons have smaller particles inside of them, known as quarks. That is where conventional ideas stop. Here is the new idea of string theory. Deep inside any of these particles, there is something else. The something else is this dancing filament of energy. It looks like a vibrating string. That's where the idea of string theory comes from. And just like the vibrating strings that you just saw in a cello can vibrate in different patterns, these can also vibrate in different patterns. They don't produce different musical notes. Rather, they produce the different particles making up the world around us. So if these ideas are correct, this is what the ultra-microscopic landscape of the universe looks like. It's built up of a huge number of these little tiny filaments of vibrating energy, vibrating in different frequencies. The different frequencies produce the different particles. The different particles are responsible for all the richness in the world around us. And there you see unification, because matter particles, electrons and quarks, radiation particles, photons, gravitons, are all built up from one entity. So matter and the forces of nature all are put together under the rubric of vibrating strings, and that's what we mean by a unified theory.
So that was the science portion of it. I hope I haven't lost everyone. I'm gonna put
Okay. So let's move to the second one now that, you know, I made my point about how I think that things are at a kind of critical threshold almost in science where a breakthrough, I believe, needs to happen eventually. I don't know when exactly, although I'm going to talk about it later, my opinion about it. And as a natural result of that, I believe that astrology would become relevant because that's how it has been. That's the nature of astrology. It is based on an understanding of reality that incorporates truths that I believe have not yet been integrated back into the mainstream. So let me talk about that. So the way I'm using astrology right now as a term is that it's a tool to describe and predict cross-dimensional patterns over time, and that it encompasses this intertwinement of physical and non-physical in a very useful way to do that. Today's astrology is not purporting to be scientific. It's not holding itself to that standard. Currently, it's resting on the intuitive process of individual astrologers, and there's no formal system to monitor for inconsistencies and inaccuracies. So if we talk about a modern scientific astrology, it would have to be a newly defined and created phenomenon. So to talk about this, I am going to go over the issue of causality. I'm going to talk a little bit about mechanisms of astrology that can be discussed coming from a consciousness-based perspective. I'm going to call it a consciousness-based perspective from now on to kind of make it easier. And then I'm going to talk about the idea of laying a foundation for a scientific astrology. So causality is a big issue in terms of describing how astrology works. There's a very common notion that, or idea, that a lot of people see as the core of what astrology stands for, that celestial bodies influence terrestrial events, so that things out there are causing us to be a certain way or behave a certain way. And I actually see that as one of the main ideological hurdles in the modern discourse. I think that the counter arguments to this idea, or people shutting down the idea of astrology automatically because of it, is a little bit justified because of the following. There's limited evidence that electromagnetism and gravity could capture the totality of what astrology does. There might be influences, but it's a limited way to explain what allows astrology to work. And if we look at the evidence, Venus, Mars, and Pluto, for example, have little to no magnetic field, and Mercury's is weak. So these are, they're important planets for us, and in terms of, making meaning out of a chart. So that doesn't really help. Gravitational forces clearly have tangible effects. Just, the example of moon and tides is, it's not debatable, but it's likely too non-specific, is my opinion, because this is, a force between two large masses. It's hard to explain the kinds of subtle detail about, let's just say, a human life theme or emotion or, behavior. It's hard to kind of put those two together or to use gravity to explain that. Another piece of evidence, I think, against that argument is that a lot of what we're doing is not based on physical objects, and these are very important, again, aspects of astrology. Zodiac signs themselves are not, as we know, the constellations, they're not reflective of physical things. Houses, sensitive points, lunar nodes as well. The mathematical points and mathematical relationships are a major source of meaning and interpretation, indispensable ones. And abstraction also has an important role. Just, progressed charts and horary astrology are very strong examples of that. And just the simple fact that zodiac signs can be felt, like for people who are sensitive to energies, let's call it, when Cancer is at the midheaven, you can feel it. So what is that? That's not something out there. So I see it more as the flow of reality or the collective consciousness that these things are a reflection of, and they're not really causal at all, as far as I'm concerned. So I would say that this is definitely something to explore in terms of what kinds of subtle effects might these planets have on us. I don't think it's something to throw away, but I don't think it explains astrology fundamentally at all. And there's also the issue that physics, as I'm saying, I think, is in flux with these issues of what is causation, what is physical reality, how do things form into physical reality. So these are open questions even for physics. So maybe we can just wait until those things become clearer to discuss how the planets might be affecting us. I don't think we'll be held back if we don't kind of talk about it in that way. So I'm going to talk about what I see as the core mechanisms of astrology. And in some ways, this might be even further from the mainstream scientific narrative. But if you are open to the idea of consciousness or consciousness-based perspective, then it has its own coherence and could be seen as rational. So coming from that consciousness-based perspective, how or why astrology works can be described by, I categorize them as soft and hard mechanisms, mostly because of the times we live in, where the soft mechanisms I'm going to talk about are based on intuitive things that, it's kind of categorically not within science. So I'll just call those soft mechanisms, but they are very important, and I think eventually could also be approached scientifically. So direct perception and intuitive knowledge is at the core of what astrology stands for, because the planets have their own vibrational signatures. Those are physical objects, but zodiac signs have their vibrational signatures as well. And like I said, they're not physical objects. And we use those and also combine them with the inherent meaning of numbers and geometric characteristics. Just the fact that, the number 12 signifies endings, everything is divided into 12, or angles, the 90-degree angle means something to us, that kind of thing. It's reflective of an intuitive kind of knowledge base that we're using. And in the moment when you're sitting with a client or when you're looking at a chart, you're constantly using intuitive observations, and that's okay in astrology. We're not shutting it down, and we're using it as a part of the process. The hard mechanisms that I'm talking about they're concepts that are already established in science, but the study of consciousness also adds a wealth of information to it. So those are the mechanisms I'm going to get into with a little bit more detail. One is time. So the science of time, and what is time and how does it behave? And the second one is fractals and their relationship to reality. So science of time. So if you look on Wikipedia, the definition of time, one of the first sentences, I believe, when I last checked, was that time is what a clock displays. And coming from a consciousness-based perspective, that's too limited. A clock does display time, and that's a reflection of time. But on a deeper level, time would be described as the sequential nature of reality. So that the successive snapshots that I mentioned earlier, that things flow one after another. That's just how we have things structured in our human experience. And this includes everything, kind of, the tapestry of consciousness. Again, this could be internal experience, it could be external, individual, collective. All of that is always going forward, snapshot by snapshot. And when I say science of time, there are patterns to observe and descriptions of time that are possible. One of them is that there are patterns. So patterns exist in the way time flows. There's logic to it, there's mathematical precision to it, and there are themes. The processes that we see in nature, for example, like I said earlier, a plant growing from a seed, there's something there, right? There's an intelligence to it, there's a natural process to it that knows itself and it carries it out. That kind of thing happens on every level, is the idea. From, the financial system, or, you decide to build something. All of these processes, the creative process, have patterns to them that are consistent transdimensionally. And so astrology rests on a description of reality in which events that happen on different levels are tied together in a meaningful way. We're using this all the time when we put together different experiences, like a person loses something, or they have a new job. You know, we're doing this all the time when we're reading a chart, and we draw a lot of different conclusions from one thing. And from that branches out the idea of cycles. So one of the main patterns that reality is structured with is that it unfolds in a circular manner. There are things that, you know, wax, wane, and then complete, and then another cycle starts. This is also consistent transdimensionally, and astrology utilizes that understanding of natural and planetary cycles and uses them to correlate them with cycles in the collective, societally, individually, and, you know, again, on every level. So that was science of time. Fractals are going to branch out from that. Fractals can exist without time. We could have just one picture that has a lot of fractals in it and there's no time involved, but most of the description of fractals is based on time as well. So from a consciousness-based perspective, this is basically the idea that there's repeating patterns everywhere, infinitely, any way you slice it, interdimensionally. Any topic at hand, you can see patterns and then you can see them repeat themselves in every direction. I mentioned here different systems of astrology because this is also, I believe this explains the idea of, you know, why does a sidereal astrology work versus, you know, the tropical zodiac? How can they both work at the same time? If they do, it's mostly, as far as I'm concerned, because there's many ways to describe reality, and if they're consistent and coherent within themselves, it'll work, kind of a thing. So fractals are well established in nature. You know, we know about them, and also in mathematics. This is a broccoli on the left and cabbage, sorry, with fractals in them. These are also observable as a core principle of how reality is structured on a subtle level. Again, like I said, interdimensionally. And you can use that to describe patterns and then predict things if you are coherent and consistent within that system. And you can also talk about fractals in the flow of time, which kind of starts to get a little very intellectual, but even time and repeating patterns in time have fractal qualities to them. So these are going to be useful when we try to think of astrology and how it uses fractals. Astrology operates under the principle that fractals allow for projection in time and dimensions. So just very simple examples for that. If we take any chart, we're basically taking a snapshot in time, and we're saying that that can be projected, let's say the moment of birth, if this is a natal chart, can be projected onto the whole duration of life, and we can make meaning out of that. Or for a progressed chart, again, we do 1 day for a year or 1 day for a lunar month, secondary and tertiary. We're doing this all the time. So that is fundamental to how astrology works. When I say projection in dimensions, that's also fundamental because we're saying that the position of the celestial bodies and the angles between them, for example, so physical and mathematical dimensions of something, can tell us about an individual's thoughts, emotions, behavior, life events, or terrestrial events, just basically anything we choose to focus on. We can take one thing and look at the patterns there and project it onto another thing. And if we're consistent and coherent with that, it should help us to predict and understand the flow of whatever we're looking at. So that's basically the second mechanism. I think those are very core to how astrology works, and it's not really explainable from the scientific perspective that's predominant right now. So when it comes to, you know, well, if we believe that those things can be understood as scientific because they're how reality works, then how can we make astrology useful and practical in the current world? I would say that, you know, I'm basically making a point that astrology has a potential to develop into a scientific discipline hand in hand with the evolution of modern science that I'm trying to talk about. We have a lot that we can figure out on our end, and then things are going to flow on the other end, and it might come together as the main point. there are so many practical applications, as any astrologer probably would agree, from how a business is run to making decisions in the stock market to anything. Astrology can help with that, and having a more scientific and clear astrology would help make that better. I think what's important when we think of the possibility of having a scientific astrology is that there has to be a community of shared intention where scientific discourse and rigor is prioritized. So I'm saying that there has to be intention, a collective intention, and I think it has been building, but there has to be a critical threshold and a breakthrough for that as well, where it becomes kind of manifest. And a community with a shared language would be fundamental as well, because a core aspect of science is the scientific community. You need the people, you need the peer review, you need the eyes on the work that's being done, you need the sharing of information for it to be possible. And again, a basic foundation does need to be agreed upon. And the times we live in are very conducive to the exchange of information being very rapid and open and free. So I see positive potential. And that was the second point. Now I'm going to use astrology to talk about what I see in the next decade or so in terms of, if there is a critical threshold, if there is a breakthrough that might happen, what do we see in the future astrologically? So here I did say that it's a matter of time that astrology will be integrated into mainstream science. And again, I don't know what that matter of time is, but I think that there's potential in what I'm seeing for the transits that are coming up. I'm going to start, though, by going back to this slide with the scientific revolution. I want to mention where astrology was at during these time periods. There's a proto-Renaissance that's in the 12th century. Some people call it the proto-Renaissance, where astrology started to become an actual part of the structures of society. And then there's Renaissance proper, or the Italian Renaissance, where astrology continued to grow and flourish. These are times when astrology was a main part of, for example, medical education. So these times existed. And then we have the scientific revolution, and the beginning of the end of astrology's acceptance in the mainstream happened. So if we also go to this slide with the 1900s, and we have this trajectory with astrology, basically, if it is true that there needs to be a pretty significant change in how reality is understood scientifically, and things that were formerly seen as divinatory or unacceptable scientifically become more of a topic of discussion under the concept of consciousness, we could also wonder what the 21st century is going to show for astrology and its place in society. And so the transits, I'm going to look at the outer planet transits because there's exciting things happening, exciting and a little, uncomfortable. We'll see what, I'll be curious to see what others think. But we have Pluto in Aquarius, we have Neptune in Aries, and Uranus in Gemini. These are all going to be, big shifts in where we're at right now when Pluto finally establishes itself in Aquarius, and then Uranus and Neptune changing signs. These are all big and they're happening in the next few years. I'm going to talk about, I'm going to talk about some specifics about these transits, and the bottom line is that I don't think we're going to get away with not beginning to integrate consciousness into society and science during Pluto and Aquarius, but I don't know. I might be wrong. Things change very quickly, but sometimes also it seems like they have to change very gradually. So I don't know where we're at with these topics, but it looks promising. One thing I'm going to talk about is Uranus and Gemini. I'm almost done. I hope I'm not over my time. Uranus and Gemini is going to activate the core meaning of the current Neptune-Pluto cycle, which was in Gemini in 1891. It started in 1891. And Uranus in Gemini is going to go over that range several times in 2027, 2028. And during that period, that retrograde period, it's also going to have its return to the USA natal chart, Uranus. That's one piece. The second one is Neptune sextile Pluto is having another phase, a closing, well, it's not a closing sextile, but it's the last of 3 opening sextiles. That's going to be in Aries, Aquarius, and it's covering that same range again, 4 to 14. This was 7 to 8, so it's going to be triggering this Neptune Pluto as well. And last, there's a Saturn Neptune conjunction in Aries, which signifies a new cycle, and I see is pretty promising in terms of meaning as well. I'm going to talk about those briefly. So just to give the context in terms of where science was at when that Neptune-Pluto conjunction happened, at the end of the 19th century, there was a common sentiment before subatomic particles were discovered. A common sentiment, I'm not saying everyone was thinking this, but I think it was general enough to be noted in Wikipedia. And this is Max Planck quoting his teacher. Physics was seen as a highly developed, almost fully mature science, which now that the discovery of energy had crowned it, so to speak, would soon have assumed its final stable form. Of course, there might still be a speck or a bubble to be reviewed and reclassified from one angle or another, but the system as a whole stands pretty secure, and theoretical physics is noticeably approaching the level of perfection that geometry has already achieved centuries ago. And Pluto heard this, said, hold my beer, and had the Neptune-Pluto conjunction in 1891 and 92, after which things started to change significantly. New radioactive elements were discovered, X-rays, and then the electron, and everything kind of led to what I showed about the 1900s, where things started falling apart in terms of the Newtonian way of understanding things, object-based way of understanding things, and nothing was the same again. And Neptune, Pluto in general, it brings the deepest and most large-scale changes of the planetary cycles, being the outermost planets. Pluto is a dwarf planet, of course, but we call it outer planet. And I would say that it brings, very deep surfacing of the unconscious and the interaction between the underworld and the timeless and spiritual. And this is usually a not very comfortable process, where fears and delusions and attachments have to be confronted, so that very things that are inherently human, values and principles, can be pushed through from layers of programming we have that go against it. And that 1891 Neptune-Pluto conjunction led to these opening sextiles, as I mentioned earlier. There were 3. I have this graph because it's interesting to see how many times they sextile. This, the one in the 50s was 15 times, 70s, 80s was 21 times, exact sextiles. And then we're going to be experiencing 13 starting in 2026 through 2032. And the sextile could be described as Neptune and Pluto working together as reflections of the cutting edge of human evolution. And I like seeing what it looks like in real time. This is going bi-weekly over 6 years. They're going to be in constant communication with each other pretty much in the signs of Aries and Aquarius. And we'll see what that looks and feels like. If we add Uranus to the picture, so this is where the Neptune sextile Pluto is, 2026 through 2032. This is Uranus in Gemini, 2025 through 2033. Uranus in Gemini on a very basic level could be described as revolutionary ideas and exchange of those via communication and learning. But on top of that, we have, as I said, the USA Uranus return, which will happen every time Uranus is in Gemini. but it also is coinciding with the Neptune sextile Pluto that's hitting those same degrees as I mentioned earlier. So it's a bit different this time. The previous USA-Uranus returns coincided with the American Revolutionary War. The Uranus return was during the war 3 times, and the American Civil War, the 3 passes happened 11 days prior to the war. And during World War II, we had 1 Uranus return, and that was during the war as well. So it's notable. We can't really say for sure what's going to happen, but the past 3 Uranus returns were very intense. And I'm going to zoom in on those dates of the Uranus return that's coming in 2027 and 2028. You can see that Uranus is basically in communication with Neptune and Pluto on the 1st and 3rd one, and only Pluto on the 2nd. This is still pretty significant because I looked at the past 3 USA returns and there were absolutely no tight aspects with Neptune in any of them. They were kind of in a different story. There was 1 tight sextile with Pluto in the one in 1944 when Pluto was in Leo. And there were 3 tight semi-sextiles with Pluto in the Uranus return of 1860, 1861. So, you know, if we take that as less significant in terms of, you know, semi-sextiles, Pluto and Uranus were not seeing each other. There's a harmonious relationship here between the 3 planets that I think is notable if you look at the context of the past 3 returns at least. And then I'm also going to look at, let's see, how can I put this? That's the perspective of the USA return. This is the perspective of what Uranus is doing with Neptune and Pluto over that time period. So Uranus is sextiling Neptune 5 times from 2025 to 2027, and it's trining Pluto 5 times from 2026 to 2028. And that looks like this in the graph. So these points are when Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto are all together, very close to each other. 2025, there's one where it's a little looser, in 2028 as well. But there's basically an ongoing story where they're all interacting very closely with each other, and the Uranus return happens around here. So if you look at it with this animation, this is, again, 2026 through 2032. This is the bi-weekly where you can see the communication between them. This is a quicker one, bi-monthly, that I found helpful because you can see that at the very beginning, there's a lot of resonance and then they kind of part ways. But that intense period at the beginning basically is what we're seeing here in the graph. And so basically this is the Neptune sextile Pluto range. This is the Uranus return. You're not seeing the bottom, but this is sextile Neptune, trine Pluto. There's a lot of overlap with important transits, and so I was trying to come up with a way of describing this, and yikes, wow, ouch, and yay came first, and then I tried to make it a little more developed. Basically, we have the end of a first chapter of the Neptune-Pluto sextiles. It's the 3rd opening sextile phase. So some kind of beginning of a end of the first chapter, sorry, is starting. The USA-Uranus return, at the very least, we could say that there's going to be animation around radical changes in thinking. We can't really say what it's going to lead to, but I think it's fair to say that there's going to be radical changes in thinking and maybe some restlessness around that. And then this resonance between Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, I'm calling an outer planet symphony, where the breakdown and dissolution that Neptune and Pluto would bring will make space probably for higher and deeper truths that all of those, the 3 of them stand for those truths to be able to come down to the ground a little bit more. And I'm also pointing out this sensitive period where everything seems to be coming together. There are those 2 points where Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto are very close to each other. And during that time, basically it's Uranus sextile Neptune and trine Pluto all happening at once. They overlap there. It's also the period leading up to the Uranus return and the beginning of the Neptune-Pluto sextile period. So it's some kind of, intense coming together of all of those things. I'm just noting it as a sensitive period. I'm not going to try to project what it may stand for. That just stood out. Finally, Saturn conjunct Neptune. I'm going to talk about André Barbeau, who has been pretty popular lately because he predicted the pandemic in 2011. He passed away in 2019. And he talked about this Saturn conjunct Neptune in 2026 that's coming up. In the quote I'm going to give in a moment, he's talking about Uranus and Pluto, well, referring to it, implying it, because he's talking about the harmonious working together of them. That quote is, well, first he's talking about Saturn, Neptune in general. But when hunger brings the wolf out of the forest, human need increases the collective demands of a frustrated population which has no hope. So this conjunction is about popular insurrections that are usually fired by ideological beliefs. The next conjunction in 2026 is the most benefic configuration of the century, and its interplanetary partnership will work for the best in a splendid relaunch of civilization. It contains a harmonious relationship between primordial polar opposites, the coming together of the external and the internal, rational and spiritual, mind and soul, human beings surpassing themselves while experiencing life on a higher level. He said this in 2014. Very inspiring. And I'm thinking of this, since it's in Aries, as, let me go back to this spiritualization of the modern self, because we've been kind of in the Western world exploring what it means to self-assert and prioritize the self. And I see that as an important part of our evolution. But the next stage might be to confront disconnection as we did that. Narcissism, disconnection from self and others, and all of that would ultimately result in greater self-fulfillment. So I'm seeing this conjunction as a reflection of that. Notably, both Saturn and Neptune are retrograding back into Pisces in July 2025, and they return to Aries around the same time again in January, February. So they're in some kind of working together mode, very close to each other a lot of the time already. And then all of that culminates in on February 20th in 2026 with that conjunction. And the North Node is also in Pisces during that period. So putting it all together, if we look at, Uranus in Gemini starts July of 2025, Neptune sextile Pluto July of 2026, and the Uranus return in July 2027. So very powerful times is my bottom line of all of this, and I'm excited to see what happens. I think that there's basically a lot of potential for awakening. I mean, it's a cliche term, but getting in touch with our human nature and our spiritual side, and that would apply for every aspect of our reality, societally and individually. So I'm hopeful for the future. That was a lot, so I will just end with a message about, we might have to go through difficult times. Things are never necessarily easy when big changes are happening, but when you let go of fear, the truth will appear. So simple and clear. That's from a song called Heart's Mystery. And thank you everyone for listening. That's my bibliography.
Thank you very much, Ferda. We do have a couple relevant questions to your presentation. First of all, we would like to know what software you're using for the chart graphics.
Sure. It's actually at the bottom of this slide. Astrology is what I used, the Mac version of it.
Okay, and where can we revisit this information and your definition of astrology specifically? That this is much appreciated. What is your next research project relating to astrology? So just to sort of reinforce, this will be available on YouTube, but what is your next research project?
I don't have anything that I'm planning as of now. I'm leaving it to whatever comes next. I'm not sure.
Leaving it for your advanced diploma, perhaps.
Maybe, yes.
And we have a really nice comment from Randall Hardy, just says, bravo, well done. Lots of thank yous for your hard work. And I do believe that Bruce would like to say a few words. Thank you, Bruce.
Okay. Well, nice job summarizing nearly everything, Ferda.
Thank you.
It's a real problem in one basic sense, to really pull that together in a way that it can be applied to astrology. I mean, I understand the difficulties you went through. I think your discussion about consciousness and the history of science and the philosophical components of all that brings to the table subject matter that would take at least one lifetime to grapple with. So, you obviously have some strong Sagittarius points in there, and you attempted to do something. But what I would add that assuming that if consciousness is embraced by science and philosophy as the ultimate component, the basic component of reality, you're doing more or less the same thing as what the materialistic scientific community is doing in regards to reality. It's called physicalism in science. And if you take the position where both are relevant, you now have a dualistic philosophy. So I tend to back off from that whole debate because it's so complex and I'm not qualified to grapple with the whole thing at once, and opt for what I would call a naturalistic position as being, pretty much a harmonious observer. But you make a good point that the current model of science, which is reductionism, does not have room for astrology, primarily because astrology cannot define itself in reductionist terms. In other words, if there were a large number of astrological studies that could be modeled mathematically, where you could take the material you're working with and reduce it, there would be acceptance by the current scientific establishment. But that is not easy to do in astrology, and there's no funding for that. So nobody's going to do it. And so I think what you're trying to say is that we need to wait, or people in astrology at least need to wait till science embraces a consciousness perspective, a primacy of consciousness. I like, as I said before, I would say it might be more than that. It might be some kind of multifaceted position. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Irvin Laszlo, who's even projected another force. The scientific community talks about quantum vacuum. So it just goes on and on and on and on. It's very complex. The second point I want to make is that you're implying all along that astrology is a single thing. And what I think what appears to me what you've been doing is looking at astrology as a practice, but also having the requirement of some kind of scientific credibility. And I would say that the best way to deal with that is to break up astrology into, call it a subject, and make distinctions between the practice of astrology. Astrology is a scientific discipline. Astrology, the philosophy of astrology, research in astrology, history of astrology, and so on. That's what every other subject does. That's what medicine does, and that's what psychology does. And I think it would be a lot easier for people in astrology to function without having to constantly be under pressure from the scientific community to judge what they're doing, because you would have another branch of people that are interested in astrology that are actively working on some way of framing astrology as a scientific discipline. And the practitioners could do their own business. most of which is extremely difficult to test. So anyway, that would be my, one criticism of your proposal there. But yeah, so I don't think that astrology needs to be explained in a theory of everything. And I think astrology should be seen as a subject with a practice and a scientific component to it. And I think you were going in exactly the right directions in regard to time and fractals. Fractals is really one part of a much larger subject that we could call system science. And that would include things that are called, subject area called complexity, which is studied quite a bit. Santa Fe Institute studies complexity, and that would incorporate fractals as well, and many other things that have to do with systems. And another key term would be emergence, which gets to the idea that every single thing that astrology studies is a self-organizing system. And this leads to, I think, a very important point that you're talking about in the history of science today, that scientists are grappling with quantum mechanics and dealing with things like non-locality. There's a whole other trend in science that's looking at systems. And I would argue that that approach to science, which is not complete by any means yet, would be the area where astrology would be most welcome. The physics community that's a tough nut. They're going to be the last ones to give up on physicalism, I think. But I think that your outline of it is generally right, and I do share your optimism. I do share your general point that astrology will be much more welcomed into science when science changes. But we got to look at science as something that needs to be broken down into parts, and there are different kinds of science and different perspectives and the branches of science and so on. So it's more likely that one branch or one theme in science will embrace astrology before the others. It may not be a single scientific revolution, but I see what you were getting at, and I think these are all very important topics, and I'm glad to see that somebody's doing them, because most people have their heads so totally in the horoscopes of people that they don't realize that there's a much bigger world out there. So hopefully we'll have some more scientific revolutions in the near future, and circumstances for us poor people in astrology will be better. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you for being my advisor, Bruce. Yeah, your input was very much appreciated.